Welcome everyone. Hope you've all had time to get something to eat and to drink. And it's just so wonderful to see a full house here, to see all of you here in the room. And I know that we're also streaming, so welcome to those of you who are watching. For this panel that we're doing, Driving Forward Women in the Gulf Assess the Changing Landscape. This is such an important moment in Gulf history, really. It's been a remarkable period of both generational transition and of socio-political change. And within this change, we've seen some real shift in attitudes in the Gulf, both on the part of some segments of society and in Gulf governments towards the integration of women much more in public space and in an official capacity. And I wanted to, I've been watching all of this as somebody who's been watching the Gulf for many, many years, almost 2 decades, I think, and seeing the kind of much more quick coming changes in the past couple of years. I sat down as well with my research associate, Mael Farhan, who's also from the Gulf, and we were just trying to think about a lot of these different changes, and I thought I would take a moment with you just to give you a scope of some of these rapid shifts and the much more growing public face of women that we're seeing across the Gulf. We've seen a lot of high-profile appointments of women to government ministries and diplomatic missions. Some 30% of the cabinet of the UAE right now is women. And of course, we have the first female spokesperson for the Saudi embassy here in Washington. We've had appointments of women in Saudi Arabia and Qatar to consultative councils. And of course, previously before that in Bahrain and in Kuwait and as well in Oman and the UAE, women elected to offices. Much more we've been watching to the entry of women into the legal field in areas that were once prevented to them, with women being trained as lawyers and prosecutors in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait and appointed as judges in the UAE. We have just this year a new personal status law or family law in Bahrain, along with initiatives for greater gender balance that we see coming out through ministries in Bahrain and also in the UAE. Women, of course, have always, but even more now, are taking prominent roles in business. We've seen that, of course, for some time in Kuwait and Bahrain, but now as well in taking these very prominent roles in other countries, which is epitomized in Saudi Arabia by a woman, Sarah Suhaimi, being the first one appointed to lead a stock exchange in the Middle East. And of course, the announcement that gave the name to this panel, that women will soon be able to drive in Saudi Arabia. And perhaps equally or even more significant, the withdrawal of the arresting powers of the religious police that has opened up a little bit more social space for women in the kingdom. So that's just kind of a taste of these changes that have been happening. Like I said, some of these extending over a decade, but really accelerating in the past couple of years. And of course, at the same time, we see all these changes, a lot of them you see being instituted by governments. We've seen a lot more engagement and activism by women in society. The rise of social media, of course, has provided a new means of expanding campaign, both for women's driving, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia, and increasingly to end the guardianship system in the kingdom. And to look at the increasing area of online activism, I really want to commend to you a new report that we just put out by Noura Douaiji, who's looking at this new area of Saudi women's online activism. We had copies up at the front door, and I hope that you'll all take a look at that report. We thought then is a good time to sit down and really to assess this changing landscape and to think about what opportunities then are being opened up to women, and also what really are the challenges that remain. And to have this discussion, I couldn't think of 2 more women who would be better to take a view of this. 2 women who are really very well known for their scholarship, for their advocacy, and for their activism on women's rights and on women's empowerment. So you have your brochures with you with more lengthy personal histories of these women, but I wanted to take a moment to introduce them from here as well. My far left, we have Loujain al-Hathloul. She's now a master's student in social research at the Paris-Sorbonne University in Abu Dhabi. She's very well known, as everyone knows, working very much on issues of human rights within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but very much focused on women's rights. And she became known not only in the kingdom but internationally for her challenging of the ban on women's driving, which resulted in a lengthy detainment for her within the kingdom. She's been a very powerful and I must say a persistent voice in this new realm, especially of social media and also off of it, both working in activism and in advocacy for women within the kingdom. And we're really thrilled to have her here in Washington.
Thank you.
We also have Alanoud Al-Sharekh. Alanoud is a consulting partner at Ibtikar's strategic consultancy and also a research associate at the London Middle East Institute at SOAS in the University of London. I've known Alanoud for some time, and I've always just been so impressed by her poise and the way that she balances and wears all of these different hats and trying to understand much more and to pursue the rights of women in the Gulf and across the Middle East. You can kind of look at her lengthy bio to get a sense of the breadth of her work. She's the chairperson of the Abolish 153 campaign, which I think we'll have a chance to speak about today, that is attempting to end honor killing legislation in Kuwait. She's worked in both academia and in government, holding fellowships at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, as well as at the Institute for International and Strategic Studies. She's done consultancy at Freedom House and at the UNDP, and she was also a strategic advisor for the Kuwait National Security Bureau, so also working with the Kuwaiti government. She's taught in Kuwait and in Europe, and has some very notable academic publications. And she was also awarded the Knighthood of the National Order of Merit by the French government in 2016 for her dedication to improving women's rights in the region. I hope we'll have more chance to talk about that experience. So I thought today we would just have a conversation with these women. I'm going to ask them a few questions here, and then I'm going to leave plenty of time so that you can also ask your questions, both for those of you that are here with us and also if people want to send us questions via Twitter. We're happy to receive those as well. Why don't we start? I thought, in thinking about this, it might be nice to start on a little bit more personal level because we know that it's not always easy to speak out on these issues in the Gulf region. So I was wondering, and we'll start with Loujain, if you could just tell us a bit more about your own personal motivation, like how you came to be interested in engaging in advocacy on women's issues, and how you chose to take a public stance and some of your experiences in doing this.
Sure. So basically everything started in 2012 when I started noticing the lack of identity that we had online as Saudi women on Twitter mainly and on YouTube. So by then I noticed that we had a role, and I understood the importance of creating a real identity for Saudi women before trying to change our reality or our situation in terms of legal aspect. So I started in 2012 tweeting and vlogging with my full identity in hope of encouraging more women to declare their full identity in front of the public. So this started my activism, and this also motivated me in pursuing more rights or requesting or demanding more rights for women, starting from there. Also, when I went back to Saudi, you are on a daily basis confronted by a lot of challenges, majorly mobility. So on a daily basis, you go and beg everyone to try and transport you from a place to another for simple and basic need, going to school, work, or going to the grocery store, for instance. So by facing this directly, I decided to do something about it. I understood the privilege that I had as a Saudi woman for having a supportive family. If it wasn't for my dad and my husband eventually, who supported me and supported this work that I've done so far, I wouldn't be here today and I wouldn't have done all this for so many years. So by understanding this privilege and by understanding the need to create some change, I decided to get into this new challenging experience, I guess. So this is my personal motivation so far. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is how it started and how it is continuing until today.
Alanoud, can you tell us a bit about how you, what your motivation was in starting to do the work that you do? I mean, as an academic, but also as an advocate.
Sure. I mean, I'm very happy to be here today and to give voice to the idea that women are going to be driving change in the GCC. It's an idea I'm very much attached to, and I've dedicated my life's work to seeing it become a reality. We're not there yet, but hopefully in the next generation, we will be. For me, the idea that Kuwait is a democracy only materialized on the 16th of May, 2005, when women got their full political rights. Before that, I think it was in a uniquely myopic position because it was a democracy that was only open to one gender and one voice. And I found it very difficult to grow up in a country that was only semi-democratic in the sense that I was invisible in it, in the political sphere. So the minute that we got our political rights, I thought that it's very important to start working on advocacy so that we can get the rest of our rights, because gaining our political rights was only the first step. We had been invisible in the public sphere when it comes to policy making and prioritizing our needs as women, and our needs are the needs of an entire society. It's not just one gender. So what's good for women is good for the entire community and the country. And so first we started with trying to motivate women to go out and vote, to motivate women to go out and run, to motivate women to get a little bit angry about the fact that they've been marginalized for such a long time. And the way to do that is to raise awareness, to explain to them the laws that discriminate against them and the practices that make it impossible for them to be on equal footing with men. I don't think that it's a question of merit. It's a question of the playing field not being level. So we have to try and level it. This is a universal problem, but it's more acute in our part of the world. And unfortunately, it's becoming a problem in Kuwait. Our positions of leadership for women have gone down in the past 5 years from 15% to 10%. So we're making progress, but not when it comes to women's leadership.
Well, both of you really spoke about the importance of putting your own voices out there, and also the need for not only advocacy, but for education, for basically being a voice to explain and to look at things that were going on within your countries. Can you talk a little bit, Loujain, then, in the introduction, I mentioned a number of the advances, and we hear about these very strongly here in the United States and applaud them. Can you tell us from your perspective what it's been like as somebody who's kind of been on the front row and very much working behind the wheel to push for these changes in Saudi Arabia? Kind of what is your assessment or your thinking about the landscape for change for women in Saudi Arabia today?
Okay, so we need to acknowledge the fact that we have moved forward in the status quo for Saudi women. baby steps, but we have made some progress in the subject, in the matter. I will highlight a few things that impacted our lives directly. Majorly the social, our social life, by relaxing the social restrictions after stripping the religious police power and authority from arresting people. That sort of created a more relaxed society, and it has a lot of meaning for women in particular, because we don't need to think twice for going outside anymore. We don't need to think about being persecuted by or being followed by the religious police. So that has impacted our daily life. Another thing that changed in Saudi is for a group of women who are the divorced and the widows, where they were allowed to be given family cards to represent their kids and to finish their documents. So these are changes that we need to acknowledge, and we need to understand the importance for women in Saudi. But yeah, we still are in the beginning. We're still starting in the movement for progress for the women's situation. Lately, we have heard about the right of driving in Saudi, where it will be implemented by next year, inshallah. This is a great advancement, and it will change the daily life for women, and it will facilitate their mobility in Saudi, which will empower them in creating and developing their careers and their personal lives. So yeah, this is basically the assessment that I've witnessed and I lived as a Saudi activist and a person who advocated for rights. But we still have a lot to do. Not in terms of demanding for our rights, but starting with raising awareness, starting with educating women about the importance of their rights, about what are their rights actually, and how can they do to request more, to demand more of them, and how can they challenge the status quo, and how can they confront the government with all the restrictions they're facing. So there's still a lot to be done, yani, and a lot of risks to be taken. But we're still resisting, and we're still hoping for the best for Saudis back home.
So. Personally, how have you sensed the receptivity for these changes that are being made
by the
within
people?
kingdom? Mm-hmm.
Very positively, actually. Everyone has been very excited about the latest changes in Saudi. Everyone is hoping for more. Everyone is looking forward to hear more about the advancement for Saudi women, especially by Mohammed bin Salman, who's been quite energetic in this field. So we're welcoming all this change. We're appreciating all of it, but that does not mean we are satisfied by it. We still want equal rights. We're still demanding more changes for the status quo, more development, and more improvement to the status quo in the women's situation in Saudi. So it was very well received, especially by the people who resisted it back in the days. So let's take, for example, the driving campaign. In 2013, when I started personally campaigning in the campaign, a lot of people resisted it. A lot of people considered it haram. A lot of people considered it outrageous to even consider to consider women being allowed to drive in Saudi. So, by the years and by continuously speaking about it and demanding, we've successfully changed the general mentality, the general acceptance of this matter. Until today, when the announcement was made, the resistance was minimal. It wasn't as we experienced it in 2013 and before that with Manal al-Sharif, for instance, or the women of 1991, who just were atrociously and so badly treated when they've committed the crime of driving. So we've improved not only by the changes, the legal changes for women, but we also improved in the general acceptance of the people towards women's rights and their acceptance and their understanding of the importance of women getting their equal rights to men.
Thank you. Alanoud, I wanted to ask you because working within the Gulf and having traveled to Kuwait for a number of years, Kuwait is often looked at as a leader in terms of both its kind of social development, political development, having gotten oil wealth early on, having had a lot of these early struggles, and many people in the Gulf look up to Kuwait. And you have had women that have been extremely well educated for a long period of time, have taken roles of importance in public lives, in the universities and in business. But you're kind of conveying, I think, in your answers, in your comments, some sense that Kuwait still has a long way to go, and perhaps even there's been some sort of backsliding in thinking and the positioning of women within Kuwait. So what can you tell us about that history in Kuwait, how that development's kind of moved forward and maybe backwards at times? And I thought it might be interesting to think about that in terms of then changes that we're seeing in Saudi Arabia and how you can push forth changes that will really be sustainable.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kristin. I'm extremely proud to be a Kuwaiti, and especially to be a Kuwaiti woman. I stand on the shoulder of giants, the first generation of women to get scholarships and study abroad in the 1950s. They came back and removed the abaya. And that's why we don't have a uniform enforced on us in Kuwait, because these women decided they didn't want to be hypocrites wearing the abaya in their country and not wearing it when they were studying in Cairo. So they were supported by open-minded families, and they were supported by a country that decided to be flexible and leave the choice open to women, whether they wanted to embrace the traditional way of dressing or whether they thought they were moving on to a new modern time where they didn't need to abide by that. And this freedom of choice, this respect for women's right to have choices, I think pretty much dictated a lot of the social and professional practices that we saw, especially during the modernizing project in Kuwait. Having said that, I still don't understand why, when they embraced an electoral democracy, women weren't included in the 1960s. This is a mystery that somebody has yet to come up with a satisfactory answer. I think that what happened after the liberation of Kuwait specifically, and perhaps during the rise of Islamic rhetoric in the mid-80s, wasn't the best for progressing women's rights. There was a lot of political Islamist movements taking over the curriculums in Kuwait, taking over a lot of the key positions in Kuwait, and those dedicated a very conservative, I wouldn't say exactly a gender-friendly atmosphere. So we've had a bit of a backslide. I consider the fact that Kuwait University got segregated during that period another backslide, because segregated spaces are not woman-friendly spaces. Specifically, they're not friendly for women's leadership because they isolate women more. We have seen some improvements, but the improvements always need to be supported by top-down political will. So after many years of petitioning Kuwait University, they have finally this year reversed their decision to be, let's say, selective with their entry requirements in 3 colleges where women were required to get much higher GPAs to enter than men. This was a solution for the fact that women were graduating in much higher numbers from certain STEM degrees than men. So the requirement for men's entry was lowered while the requirement for women was made higher. This has now been changed. So this is a step in the right direction. And we've managed to overturn, for example, the passport law in 2009 through the Constitutional Court. And this is a law that required married women to get the permission of their husbands. And the Constitutional Court found that this was an unconstitutional request. I think with greater civil society movement, and in Kuwait we definitely have a higher ceiling for civil society movement, for criticism, for demands of change from the government and from our parliament, we can expect to have more of these changes happen. I have no time for organic, incremental change. I have no time for the fellow men policymakers to decide to include women. I think change, like in Saudi Arabia, should be exponential and should be bolstered by top-down decision-making. Now, Kuwait had made it very public announcement that we're going to have women judges. 3 years on, we still don't have women judges. So there are demands in civil society to change that. There are demands to change the nationality law so I can pass on my citizenship to my children. And there are demands to make Kuwait safer for women. We've just opened our first advisory center. We're going to open a shelter for abuse survivors, hopefully next month. So there are some positive movements that come from demands by NGOs and civil society and by top-down decision-making from policymakers.
Yeah. Well, you've referenced these kind of two sides, and of course we have two powerful women here who have been at the forefront of really pushing and engaged with other members of civil society and trying to create civil society organizations that can push for women's rights. But as you mentioned, and as we see in the last few years, a lot of the changes and advances have also been taken by states, and we've seen, particularly in some of the smaller, wealthier states, Qatar and especially now the UAE, a real move by governments to try to increase the public face of women within their societies. And I thought maybe we could think a little bit more about this, the role of this kind of state-led advancement. I wanted to bring into the conversation, if I can, Thoraya Al-Hashimi. She's here with us as a visiting fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute. She just completed her master's degree from Fletcher at Tufts University. And she's doing some research on women's work in the tech field and women's inclusion and advancement in the tech field. She's originally from Sharjah, and I wanted to invite her just to share with us a little bit about both what's been happening in the UAE in terms of the appointment of women, other ways in which the government is pushing for this, and how you feel, Thoraya, I'd be really interested to hear a bit more about how you feel that changes the outlook or the perception of women within the UAE.
So last month, the Prime Minister of the UAE announced the new cabinet members, and 9 positions were given to women. And the UAE is trying to push women agenda and supporting women. 50% of the UAE Emirati population are women. And the labor force participation of women in the UAE is 42%. So there is an economic need for women to join the workforce. There is an IMF study that shows by reducing the gender gap and increasing women participation in the economy will increase the GDP of UAE by 12%. And we can see that reflected from the commitment of our leaders, and it's also reflected in the UAE Vision 2021. So women and young girls in the UAE are empowered by these changes, and they feel that we can dream and we can hold a leadership position in the future in our country.
Does it, I wanted to push you a bit more on that, does it really make a difference then to see these women in these leadership positions? Because I imagine, I don't know, when you were much younger, did you have ministers, women ministers in the UAE? And what has it meant, I guess, for women to see those changes?
So in the past, we had a female minister, and she was the only one. But now you can see the increase of number, and it can become the new reality. And there is a commitment from the Prime Minister that in the future he wants to see 50% of his cabinet members to be women. So now we're at 30%, and hopefully by the future we will be able to achieve the 50% goal.
Yeah, I wanted to get some of your thinking too, because Alanoud, you said you thought in Kuwait there was also a need for this kind of commitment. I know I've been in Kuwait in conversations with women that have run for parliament or are interested in running for parliament about the whole question of quotas, for instance, in Kuwait, and the need for that. It doesn't seem to have gotten much traction, and there's a big debate about that. I just wondered if you could share your views on those issues.
Well, I think that if we look at the progression of women in the National Assembly, for example, we got our political rights in 2005, 2006, the first time women ran, no woman made it, and then 2009, 4 women made it. And this was seen as an anti-quota argument, that women could make it on their own merit. They don't need to have assigned seats for them. Cut to today, almost 12 years after we got our political rights, there's 1 woman in cabinet and 1 woman in parliament. So I think there is a lot to be said about the institutionalized and insidious obstacles to women's leadership. And of course, the fact that the media plays a huge role. There was a giant backlash against these 4 women who made it to parliament, and the women who were first given ministerial positions. The media focused on the way that they dressed or didn't, if they were wearing a hijab or not, if they were being emotional or not, and there was general disdain with their performance, and it was thought to taint the performance of all women who are going to come after them. I think it's really important that the media in the UAE focuses on the positive when it comes to women, celebrates the women who are in leadership positions. I remember seeing that one of the ministers had gone back to work a few weeks after she was taken off maternity leave, and that the media was showing this as a very positive indicator of how capable women were. So I think media had a huge role to play in Kuwait. And the fact that a lot of the gatekeeping positions that lead to a powerful leadership position, the head of co-ops, head of sports clubs, the Chamber of Commerce, basically three out of the 5 districts are not really open to women candidates in Kuwait. So there are institutional problems that I think a quota would resolve, and a quota has been shown to be successful. It's not embraced in the United States, but in many other countries, it's been shown that this is really a way to significantly increase the amount of women who are elected representatives.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's definitely a need, and I can see the great benefit of having these women in public roles. But there's also a question of how this will last and how this is perceived and how this works with the changes within society. And I'm just wondering, Loujain, if you can think a bit through in Saudi Arabia or just your views throughout the Gulf about how this dynamic can kind of play out between sort of the importance of a leadership role and then also the importance of people working within society. So
I look at as you said, as you named it, the state-led advancements in a positive and negative way. The positive element of it is that it's quick. It comes in one night. We wake up the next morning and everything was transformed in Saudi. Women can drive, there's no religious police, we can have parties, mixed parties between men and women. So it's quick, which is good for us as the new generation, the generation of the internet. And I appreciate this. I think all my generation appreciates the rapidity and the fast pace of change. The second point of its benefits is that it is not much resisted by the people. It is immediately blessed by the public as soon as the king announces it. And they will find a million reasons on how it is positive. Even if the night before they looked at it as an unacceptable change. So this is, again, a very positive aspect of it. And the third one is that it is a respected decision by the public. So as soon as the king announces it, the majority, or at least what we see on the street, is that this announcement of change is respected by the people. So these are three positive elements of having change led by the government, a change that is led by one man. But there are also some negative aspect of it, mainly that it depends on a one man's will. When will this man have this desire of bringing that change? So to be dependent on this man's decision or this man's mentality or way of thinking is a bit frustrating for us as a new generation who's hoping to see a lot of change in Saudi. Also, it is not a sustainable. It's not a sustainable way of bringing change to Saudi because, again, it is based on a one man's will, and whenever this man changes his opinion, he can eliminate all this in the following day if he wanted. So these are two downsides of having changes that are led by one man, by a government. Which brings me to ask this question on how can we protect our rights and all these advancements with such a system. Of course, the society and our work in demanding for change is important, but we do not have a proper civil society in Saudi. It's not similar to the situation in Kuwait or Bahrain, for instance, where they could mobilize and they could organize themselves under a legal umbrella. In Saudi, it's not the case. We work as individuals. We risk ourselves as individuals. Lately, whatever we've been demanding has been sort of heard by the government. I can bring as an example the guardianship system, where we demanded for a good year constantly on a daily basis on the abolishment of this law. And the government responded very in a shy way, but it actually responded to our demand. And it forced the public and the private sector to stop requesting the authorization of a guardian for many of the women's work. So, for instance, the women are not forced to, or they're legally allowed to work without the permission of their guardian. They could legally be treated in hospitals without the guardian's consent. So these are very positive aspects of our work as a civil society. But yeah, we really need to work on the sustainable aspect of it, the sustainable element of making sure that the leader does not change his mind, and making sure that the society has a legal umbrella where it can work as a proper civil society, like in Kuwait and Bahrain.
You mentioned your generation as the internet generation, and obviously a lot of your activism has taken place online. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that a bit and that whole internet space, how friendly it is for women, how effective it has been working through that, or maybe some of the difficulties too. I know in the paper that Noura Douaiji wrote for us, she talks really compellingly about a new community and a kind of role for the development of a new sort of Saudi feminism that comes online, but she also talks about a lot of the drawbacks and the kind of attacks that can happen online too. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit about your experience in that space.
So yeah, I started my activism, or I started appearing on social media and on the internet in 2012. And again, I'm repeating myself. It started because of our lack of identity on social media. We are not present as women, as Saudi women, as Loujain on the internet. So by the years, and by insisting on our identity, on putting our names out there, on putting our images, we have created a general acceptance of our presence online. We are more accepted online than in real life sometimes. When you go and knock the door of a governmental entity, a ministry or whatever, you feel the resistance by the officials. But online, we seem to have successfully reached the goal of being accepted in this social setting. Also, we have used this platform, which is not something we have in real life, where we can raise awareness, we can educate women in a very bigger, how can I say this? In a
Broader reach.
Yes, in a much broader reach than what we would be doing in real life, especially that forming ourselves, organizing ourselves, and gathering as activists is not yet permitted in Saudi. So this platform has allowed us to educate women on their rights, to raise awareness on what they need to be doing and what they need and how they can challenge the status quo. Also, it has provided a discussion among Saudis in general, from their different backgrounds, from the different communities. So all these have really played a major role in our activism online. And I will still emphasize on the fact that identity played a major role in it. We finally created a Saudi female identity on social media after so many years of resistance. So if you go online, you will see a lot of women having their pictures out there, which was unacceptable years ago, especially when I went and started my vlogging, where the majority of the comments were about my hijab or about being present as a woman online. So, and nowadays, the resistance is about what I demand for. It's not about me being present on social media. So this is a great advancement for us, thanks to the internet and thanks to all these social media platforms.
Alanoud, she talked about how Saudi Arabia doesn't have the room for these civil society organizations. Well, Kuwait's a very different kind of arena. I know you've been working on this Backlash 153 campaign. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that. And also thinking a little bit more about if there's space in this day and age, and I know we're in a period in the Gulf, and it's something that I've been writing about and thinking about a lot, of increasing nationalism amongst these states. And I'm wondering how that kind of leaves space for the kind of transnational work that is often present in the women's movement as women kind of reach outside to other groups in some of the Western countries and elsewhere. If you think that kind of advocacy is still, and cooperation is still available to you, and is it effective, or is it lessening in effectiveness?
I think that what Loujain said about not needing somebody to speak on your behalf has been not only liberating for Saudi women and giving them an identity and a voice of their own, it's been a godsend to a lot of women and civil society groups across the Gulf that were perhaps dealing with taboo subjects. The young generation now is called Generation S for smartphone, and the Arab Social Media Report finds that being able to express themselves online is part of their actually life values. It's part of their value system to have a voice, to have a platform, to be able to express the most mundane and the most interesting of their thoughts on a daily basis. I think that's very powerful. And you're talking about sustainability. I think that's what's going to guarantee sustainability. Now that our young people are used to having a voice, are used to somebody somewhere taking their opinion seriously, it's hard to dismiss them, if they're women or they're men. So when we started with our campaign to create a safer environment for women in Kuwait, to go after the most violent legislations that exist, not just in Kuwait, but on a regional level, we used social media as a litmus test to test our boundaries, to see what was acceptable, who were our champions, and what we could do to get some ground support before we would venture out in real life. And as Loujain said, it's sometimes a less friendly space. But I would also argue that being present as a woman online always comes with a burden of ambassadorship. So you can't just represent yourself, you have to represent a nation, you have to represent a religion. If you're not wearing a hijab, why aren't you wearing a hijab? If you're wearing a hijab, you could be attacked for the wrong kind of hijab. So there's this whole culture of trolling and shaming online, specifically targeted towards women. We had this idea of looking at the guardianship issue also through disciplinary violence, this idea that men were allowed, because they were legal guardian, to discipline their women, even and up to including killing them for honor reasons. And there is now a movement in the Arab world to get rid of these laws that we inherited as part of a colonial legacy, these laws that come to us from the Napoleonic Code, and that have been marketed as part of our traditions or our religion. So we went after this article, and we used the internet to gain support for it, and then we had to choose which platforms to use as well. So when we had an idea to make this very collaborative, so we were working with the Women's Committee at the National Assembly from the start, and they actually advised us. They said, don't take this to Twitter. Twitter is the so-called street, and something like this that is very nuanced, that you need to explain the history of, that you need to explain that it's not constitutional, that it doesn't conform to Islamic Sharia, it'll be very difficult to do it on a very noisy street like Twitter. So when we got more traction after 3 years of lobbying, I'm very happy to say there's a bill now to abolish Article 153 that was signed by 5 MPs, giving it urgent status. When we were on a more sort of steady ground, then we were more comfortable with taking it to Twitter, to taking our advocacy to a wider space. And it's very funny that the hashtag I am my own guardian was one of the main hashtags that took abolish 153 with it. So not only are we crossing taboos in our own spaces, but we can, join hands with other movements and take the mantle of women's issues, not only in the Gulf, but also in the Arab world, when they've abolished the laws in Jordan, Lebanon, and Tunisia over the summer, the laws that to do with kidnapping and marrying, and then the perpetrator doesn't have to go to jail if the guardian agrees. This is a victory for all women in the Arab world because a version of this law exists. So I think there is a lot of symbiosis and a lot of space that has been made easier by brave young women who go online and decide to risk their reputations and their careers and demand more rights and more visibility, a voice for young women across the Gulf.
Is that kind of a more effective way of working within the Arab sphere and the Gulf sphere than kind of working with Western counterparts? And I was just wondering if you have any ideas, too, if it's effective and what role there still remains for kind of foreign governments on this issue. Because it's usually been an issue that foreign governments have been willing to advocate for.
This is really the burden for Arab feminists. They can always very easily be accused of being, corrupted by a Western concept, as if demanding your rights is not an inherent human and basic need. So it's a catch-22. I have all the respect in the world for the idea of intersectionality in feminism and, womanism versus white woman's feminism. But I think right now, the younger generations in the Gulf especially don't seem to be burdened by this post-colonial hangover. They're not so worried if their feminism is going to be called a Western import, or if it's going to be, seen as something that is going to destroy the moral fabric of our societies. They care about their rights. They care about their freedoms. They care about being seen as a full citizen instead of a half citizen, because there's a legal guardian who, signs the marriage contract on your behalf in most states, decides who you can marry in most states. And that's just one basic thing. So I think there's a lot of room for us to learn from each other across the globe. And the issue of women's rights is a problem, whether you're talking about a wage gap in the West, you're talking about women's safety all over the world, or you're talking about guardianship issues in the Gulf and the Middle East.
Loujain, did you want to add anything to that issue?
Well, we try sometimes to organize ourselves among Khalijis in Saudi when we have shared issues. But there is also always this resistance of including a foreigner inside, even from Khaliji states. We still consider each other as consider them, as outsiders. And we keep hearing Malik Dakhal all the time as soon as we comment on any issue about women in other Gulf countries. But there is also room for not mainly working together, but being inspired by each other. I personally was inspired by Kuwaiti women, and especially, and also Bahraini women. They are, they go all the way to make the change that is needed, and they would risk themselves. They would risk their personal life and their professional life for the sake of their rights. So maybe not collaborating at this stage, since the resistance is very strong, but be inspired by each other. I think that is a good way of starting.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to go ahead and turn to all of you. I'm sure a lot of you have been thinking and coming up with questions. We have somebody in the back that will bring around a mic. So if you can just identify yourself and please do ask a question. I also welcome people, if you're following us and want to ask a question via Twitter, we will be able to take some of those questions as well.
Thank you so much for this talk. My name is Candice Davis-Packard. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And my question is for Loujain al-Hathloul.
Yes.
In Saudi, to what degree is this man betrothed, and what goes into his decision? What are his motivations? We know he has done a lot to create more freedom for women, but he's still, as you say, hesitating in some regards. So why is he hesitating? What is really going into his motivations, his decisions? And I hope that you might touch on the clerics and their influence over him. So that's my question. Thank you.
That's a very hard and complicated question. And it's hard to answer as well, because we've never had the privilege of sitting down with him and understanding his plans, sharing thoughts with him. So it's hard for us to understand what is he doing and what he wants, where he wants to get to. So, but by the plans he's been putting in the past 2 years with his Vision 2030, we sort of understand a little bit where he wants to go, and mainly make this revolutionary and transforming the country economically with his vision. So everything that is standing on his way for making this vision true will be changed. when it comes to the reputation of Saudi, it had to be ameliorated. It had to be polished by whatever way was possible. And the driving ban was the major influencer of the Saudi reputation. So we only can guess at this stage, especially for women, because we've never sat down with him. Not like men in his early stages when he started getting power. He kept meeting with a lot of youth, making all these private meetings. Women never had the chance of sitting down. So it's hard for us to understand 100% what is happening, but we can look at it through the barriers and the obstacles that are facing his vision. And if this is an obstacle, we know that it will eventually be removed. So.
Let me take, if you have questions, raise your hands. Maybe we can take a couple questions at once, too. We have some near the front of the room.
Thank you. I'm Katherine Bhaskar. I'm an international lawyer and an adjunct professor at American University School of International Service. I have a question for Loujain. It has to do with driving. Is there a possibility that once women do start driving in Saudi Arabia, there will be some sort of backlash that you have to guard against? For example, to talk about real practical instances, I know that some of the objections to women driving in the past had been, oh, it's very dangerous to drive in Saudi Arabia, which we all know. And there'll be a lot more accidents if women are allowed to drive. So, first of all, I'd like to know how you respond to that argument. But secondly, my real question is, do you foresee a backlash? And I'm struck by what Alanoud said about the women being allowed in the parliament in Kuwait many years ago, but then there was, we won't necessarily term that as a backlash, but it turned out to be not as optimistic as you originally thought.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take another question here in the front. Go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Layla Mansouri. I am also an attorney, but very much thank you for this, and I'm really interested in bringing Iranian women and Arab women together because we have a lot of similar struggles in our countries. And although she said that right now is not the time to collaborate, but I think hopefully we can overcome that soon. And another question I had is for you. You said that there aren't any civil organizations in Saudi Arabia. How difficult would it be to create one now, and have you tried? And what were you faced with?
Okay, so we have questions about potential backlash to the women's driving, and also the potential for creating more civil society organizations in Saudi Arabia.
So yeah, I will start with the backlash of the driving. We had the same conception of women and men mixing in public spaces. So we've been, the government has been resisting all this, and the religious police also has been resisting this. But lately, in the past year, we have had a lot of social changes and a lot of sort of parties, for instance, and a lot of mixed events in the streets of Saudi, where men and women, for once, were mixing normally, like any other nation. And we haven't seen any of the backlash and all the issues that we were expecting or anticipating. So people would say that women would be sexually assaulted in public if this happens, and we haven't had any issue so far from these mixing and partying and events. So I assume that the same thing will happen with the driving, where we we think and we sort of anticipate a lot of negative aspects and a backlash in it, but I don't think it will happen. I think the same, it will be the same situation as the public events that happen in Saudi with men and women mixing without absolutely not a single issue. So I'm not worried about this backlash at all. I don't think it will happen. And for the increase of accidents, I think this is international. I believe that women are poor drivers, but when you look at the statistics, it's not quite correct. And Saudi is the highest country where accidents happen and only men drive. So possibly that by women driving we'll take this number down. And we'll see. We'll have to wait for this one. For the second question about assembling and creating social civil society. Well, we had a law 2 years ago about creating NGOs in Saudi, which was a great thing to do, and it had given a lot of women in creating their personal NGOs with other women and men as well. But when it comes to assembling for rights, for activism and all of that, it's still not possible. We've tried to open a shelter and we've tried to open a center for empowering women, and it's still pending. It's been pending for quite a while right now. It's like, it's the beginning. I believe that we will be able to create it eventually by the following years, but it hasn't happened yet. And I don't know when will it happen. We're trying to pressure the government. We're trying to demand for this right of assembly, this safe umbrella, legal umbrella for us to mobilize. But it hasn't happened yet. Yeah.
The question?
Hi, Loujain. My question is for Loujain. This is Hadil from Riyadh newspaper. You said you feel it's like a one-man show, what's happening now, the change in Saudi Arabia, especially the social change. But you also said you feel like the people are excited about the what's going on. And today, Saudi Arabia, for the first time ever, is holding a big concert for the Greek singer Yani for families. And the people are participating and they're going. So don't you think it's the request of the people and the will of the people too? It's not only a one-man show, as you said?
Let's see if we have another question we can take at the same time.
Hi, Maida Ruge, Johns Hopkins Institute, SAIS. I had a question for both of you. And first of all, thanks so much for these really interesting presentations. You talked about abolishment of an article, 153, was it? Just to be clear, I wasn't entirely clear whether this was one particular part of legal guardianship. And whether legal guardianship is still in place in Kuwait. I wasn't quite clear on that. And same question, Loujain, to you. What's happening? I mean, there was a discussion, I remember, maybe half a year ago, that there would be a review of legal guardianship and one would go into direction of abolishing it. Where are we standing with that right now? And is this one of the issues that the MBS is hesitant on?
So we have a couple of questions. Loujain, if you want to start.
Yeah. You mentioned something about the one-man show and how his decision are in line with the people's will, if I understood your question. Well, there are 2 points in here. One, Mohammed bin Salman is of our generation, so his desire will tend to have to be in line with ours. And the second thing is that his vision is different from anything we've seen so far in Saudi. Well, not really, but he's a bit maybe more serious in implementing his vision. So the vision is so far an answer to our demands. There is no need for us to backlash all this, and I think it's best for us to accept it and hope for the best than just resist it for no reason. So, we need to be also thankful that he came and changed a little bit the situation in Saudi, gave us hope for more change and a better future. And for the royal decree, can I start? the status of the decree, well, it started very well. It started positively, and it was very exciting to hear a response from the government that didn't take much for them, yani, to hear from us. But the status is sort of pending right now. We haven't heard much after the 3 months time frame that they were given, the ministries were given to update Mohammed bin Salman or the king of the laws that need to be changed or revised. So we're still not really clear about the situation and how it will move forward. We're hoping that an amendment to this law will happen and a total abolishment of the guardianship will be announced. But we're not clear about what is currently happening. So,
yeah. There are still aspects of Kuwait's laws where there's very clear male guardianship over female kin. Most of them are within the personal status laws. So issues to do with marriage, for example, the male guardian has a big role to play in that. You can't marry without your male guardian's consent, or you can go to the court if his consent is unreasonable, and then the court will become your guardian in the issue of marriage, for example. There are other examples to do with custody, etc., that clearly show male guardianship over women. Besides that, in Kuwait's penal code, which is where Article 153 comes for, there is, unfortunately, a tendency to also focus on this idea of men being the legal guardians of their female kin. Therefore, they have justifications for some violent behavior. So, for example, there's Article 29 that allows some leniency in disciplinary violence, right, towards wives and daughters, etc. And it's left up to the judge's interpretation. And then there's Article 153, the one that we're seeking to abolish, which is very simply an honor killing legislation. So if a man would surprise part of his female kin, his wife, mother, sister, daughter, in a sexual act with a man and kills her, kills him, kills them both, it's treated as a misdemeanor, not as a crime. Maximum punishment is 3 years or 3,000 rupees, which is about $45. This is a very old article. It predates our constitution. We strongly believe, and clearly our elected representatives believe that too, that this article needs to be abolished because it is part of a mindset, I think, that disempowers women just by existing.
I have a question in the front.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. We're in the middle, I'm Karen Young at the Institute here. We're in the middle of a difficult conversation here in the United States about women's place in the office, in the workplace, and the culture that we create together of permissiveness, of sexual assault, of sexual harassment. So what do you think in Gulf countries, and you can speak individually, what are the barriers to creating workspaces, specifically women's inclusion in the workforce, to creating a new kind of culture that will see women as equals inside this space?
We have one more question in the back we'll take as well.
Hi, Abrar Raja, American University School of International Service. This question is specifically for Loujain. You mentioned that there's hope in that, I guess, the vision of MBS is representative or similar to what the current generation is. And that for me is a little shocking and confusing. Is there, like, I would imagine that there's some kind of fear with how quick things are happening and the reasoning behind these things. So I was wondering if you can speak more to that. Why do you think that the actions he's taking is more hopeful for the future?
We have a question about drawing upon our experience here in the United States as well, women in the workplace, if you want to start with that.
I think what you said about sexual harassment, specifically making spaces safer for women, really resonates with me. I think it's very important to note that when these changes happen in Saudi Arabia with the right to drive, a sexual harassment law is also being pushed and pushed very quickly because it is necessary to make sure that these women who are going to be on the streets and who are going to have more mobility and hopefully more visibility in the workplace are going to have a law to protect them from harassment, whether the harassment is sexual or because some legal guardian issue. So I find that as a very important and necessary step before the driving law takes effect in June. In Kuwait right now, we don't have a sexual harassment law, and I think it's very telling that as part of the Me Too conversation that's being globally taken, we haven't seen a lot of traction around it in the GCC. I think this is still very much a public-private divide. It's a very difficult issue for people to talk about. There's a lot of shame involved, even in the victim. So it's still the idea that if you are being harassed, you have brought it upon yourself. So this is really a mindset that we need to focus on changing and focus on raising awareness of it. And I've heard it mentioned many times today that in Saudi Arabia, they're having mixed parties and they're having a more joyous air of celebration. And we have an MP in Kuwait right now who's upset that we have these parties in Kuwait. So it seems like sometimes there's movement in one direction and then there's regression in another. So hopefully in the issue of creating a safer workplace for women, especially a workplace that's free from sexual harassment, we're not going to see this kind of regression because some men feel that this should be a private matter.
Loujain, if you want to address that question, and also the question of the difficulties of social change in Saudi Arabia.
The question on the presence of women in the workplace is a bit challenging in the Saudi context because women are segregated from men in the workplace in many companies and in many of the public sector. And that's alone a very challenging situation in terms of empowerment and improvement and increase, stepping to the next level for women in terms of career. So this is a situation that might be a bit unique in the Khalij, which create a lot of tension because there is this will of eliminating that segregation, but how to do it without having a backlash that is uncontrollable, where sexual harassment might increase, where the guardians will resist more on sending their on accepting that the women work. And these are very challenging questions, and the answer would be only to try it and to enforce very strong laws and implement them in protecting women in the workforce after these segregations are eliminated, of course. Also, the other challenge for women in the workforce is the guardianship, as you mentioned, where the Ministry of Labor does not enforce the consent of male guardians for women to work, but the private sector can request that from women, which is a very challenging situation, and it is preventing women from getting empowered in their careers. So this is for the professional part, and you asked a question about the social aspect of Saudi. What did you mean about which changes were you asking about?
I think it was just the general question about the change that are being implemented from below and how they're being accepted within society.
Well, in a social context, it has been very positively accepted, especially when you look at the events in the streets of Saudi. So we're hoping that the same situation will be done and accepted in the workforce as well, where when you eliminate this wall between men and women, the same acceptance will happen as a social one.
Mm-hmm. I think we have one more question here in the very front row. And while the microphone's coming, we also had a question from Twitter, which is how can you mobilize, or how important is it to generate allies amongst men as well for the changes that you want to see and what role that they can play? And we'll add in one more question as well.
It's more of a comment, if I can make a comment. First of all, it's a wonderful panel, and thank you very much to the Institute for putting this on. It's lovely to see Loujain here. I think 2 weeks ago we had Fawzia al-Bakr visiting Washington, D.C., a veteran of the 1991 driving campaign. And since we've left Saudi Arabia, it's remarkable to see the change, and I think the King and the Crown Prince and the Saudi government should be congratulated for taking those very important steps, including putting guardianship on the table as an issue, which is such an important issue. And I think it's been an instant win in terms of the standing of the kingdom internationally. That's a very good thing. But I think it has to be made sustainable. So you have to keep on driving that change forward. And that's the only way that you will get the economic boost, which I'm sure will happen. And I think that is probably, in the mind of the king and the crown prince, an important element in this. But it will only happen if you move forward on these things. So certainly our hope is that, from a German and European perspective, that the leadership will take this kind of change forward in a very determined fashion.
And did you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Pardon me, Boris Ruger, German Embassy, formerly with the embassy in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Did you want to address the question about men as allies and the importance of bringing the other sex along and the changes that are taking place?
Do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I don't think, especially since they outnumber us in policy-making positions, that we can hope to change women's situation without having male allies. The universal movement, he for she, to end violence against women is very much men inclusive, but also in our own experience in trying to challenge these violent legislations that exist in Kuwait. We have found that having male champions on our side is not only useful, it's absolutely necessary. Our voices can only carry so far, but when men are on our side, and they're on our side because they believe that this will lead to a better place, and they believe in the safety of their wives, daughters, and children, they believe that they are representing both men and women in the National Assembly. So our bill was signed by 4 young men and the lone woman in the National Assembly. And it was something that we were reassured when we started off that will never happen, because it's not a priority and it's controversial, and no moderate man would risk losing votes by supporting it. And in less than 3 years, it became a reality. So I think we absolutely need male allies, but we need persistent women first. We need brave women who are willing to look for those male allies.
I was wondering, I think we're out of time, but I wanted you kind of ended there with a hint of hope that you were kind of discouraged in a way from pursuing this thing and saw quick results in it. Both of you, as being very active in your countries, when you think about the situation right now, what does give you hope? What do you see that gives you a lot of promise for thinking about progress that can be seen for women in the Gulf? And what barriers, if you want to address too,
Yeah.
what's the most important barrier that remains? You can take it either way, or both.
Well, can I start? The hope that is keeping me still working in this is that more women are coming along and more women are joining forces. So this is incredible, and this was absolutely unimaginable 3 years ago. So to have all these women mobilize in an unofficial manner on social media is incredible. I've never imagined it, and this gives me a lot of hope and gives me a lot of energy as well to continue and to hope for the best and hope that they will be successful in taking our movement forward and making it more sustainable. So this is what is giving me hope. For the barriers, we have a lot of barriers. We have the vague laws, the cyber law in Saudi, that is a constant threat for us on social media. So as soon as we express ourselves, we never know when we will be stopped. So this is a barrier that is that we are very aware of, and we share the importance of amending it. So we've discussed the articles that are very vague and that are sort of creating fear, general fear among the youth in demanding for more rights. The other barrier for especially women on social media is sexual harassment. We always talk about sexual harassment in the workforce, but sexual harassment online is a major barrier. A lot of women stop from tweeting or posting videos as soon as they receive any, not only an insult, but to be sort of raped online. So this is a huge barrier for women. I know a lot of women who shut down all their social media activity because of that. Receiving awful pictures is another way also of creating that barrier and obstacle for us. So these are major elements that I wanted to highlight. I think you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm just going to add what you said is giving me hope. It's a new economic landscape. A dual income family is a reality right now for most of Khalijis, and it's going to continue to be a reality. And even the most stringent Islamist politicians we have all have wives that are working, all have daughters that have jobs, mostly government jobs, but still, I don't think our lifestyles are sustainable without having both men and women working. So I think the correlation between greater independence for women and for young people and the fact that they are financially independent has been proven scientifically. So I'm hopeful because of that, and I'm hopeful because I see that increasingly our leadership is becoming cognizant of the fact that young people are demanding more transparency, a bigger share in taking decisions that are going to shape their destinies. So I think the biggest barriers that are left is getting those that benefit the most from the status quo to realize that the status quo is not going to exist any longer. That is the biggest barrier, because there's a lot of people who are benefiting from it and a lot of people that want it to exist. So I think that the tide is changing, whether there's resistance or not, and I'm very optimistic.
Oh. Well, thank you to both of you. I think you spoke about finding inspiration from others abroad. I have to say that when I look to the Gulf and when I see idealistic young people, bold young people, and when I see women like you who have been working so hard to make change and very positive change in your countries, I get inspired here. And we need a lot of inspiration here in the States as well. So I want to invite you all to join me in thanking our two guests. It's really been wonderful to have both of you. Thank you.